Hi everyone and welcome to this BSME webinar on metacognition and learner autonomy in English. I'm Samantha Roden. I'm currently the Head of English at Qatar International School and I am your English network lead for this year, so I'm pleased to meet you all. Right, we'll crack on then. So, metacognition has been around for as long as I've been in teaching, and it's something that's had a revival and then it's kind of gone into the shadows again. But for me, it's been ever present and it's been a tool to enhance student progress, to increase engagement, and ultimately to allow learners to enjoy what they're doing whilst knowing about the processes involved in their learning. So we'll start off with the relationship between metacognition and progress. In order to form and strengthen neural pathways in the brain, we need to not only revisit knowledge repeatedly and regularly, but also to test it. Now, we call this neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to develop new neural pathways and to access information by storing it in a particular place. And we'll look at cognitive loads and how the brain processes that information a little bit later on. But essentially, it's vitally important for students to keep revisiting knowledge, content, themes, whatever it might be that they're studying in your English classrooms, whether it be terminology or something a little bit more abstract. They have to revisit that regularly in order to process that information. So recall and entry tasks, for instance, allow information to be processed by transferring knowledge into the long-term memory rather than students simply relearning. And this knowledge before examinations and tests needs to be or have been embedded for a long time before the examination or the test itself in order for students to access it effectively. And this is the difference between relearning and revising. If students revise regularly, they won't need to relearn things before examinations or tests. Now, I know with English, we develop skills as opposed to just knowledge or content, but the content in English goes hand in hand with those skills that we need them to demonstrate. So revisiting for us will be revisiting skills and revisiting content. Now, unless students are revisiting that knowledge that they've gained in class by reworking it and being tested on it, in excess of 70% of it will be lost over the course of a 12-month period. The answer to preventing that loss, such a profound loss then, is interleaving. And hopefully I'll be able to show you some strategies throughout this webinar to help you interleave in your lessons. How does it work then? Well, information stored in neurons, and when you learn something new, a group of neurons activate in a part of the brain called the hippocampus. It's like a pattern of light bulbs turning on. I'm reading this to you because this is a slide that I often use with my students so that they understand not just what they're learning, but exactly how they are learning it and why they're learning it. And this is a lovely article from The Guardian a few years ago called How to Treat Your Brain During Revision Time. So I would definitely recommend you ask your students to read this article. It gives them some really useful strategies, metacognitive strategies to boost their revision and to keep them calm and to avoid any stress or trauma before busy exam periods. So your hippocampus then is forced to store many new patterns every day. This increases hugely when you are revising. Provided with the right trigger, the hippocampus should be able to retrieve any pattern. But if it keeps getting new information, the overworked brain might go wrong. That's what happens when you think you've committed a new fact to memory, only to find 15 minutes later that it's disappeared again. Now, we can all relate to this as teachers, can't we? We have a list as long as our arms when we come in the morning, and it's very easy to forget the important things when we are absolutely bombarded with stimuli and people and tasks throughout the day. So what we need to do as practitioners is to encourage our students to discern the key information from the extraneous information that they're receiving throughout the day. And that extraneous information doesn't stop at lessons. The extraneous information could be an argument they've had with their friend. It could be certain pressures at home. It could be a lack of self-esteem. It could be something to do with social media. We don't know because there are myriad things going on for our learners. So what we have to do, particularly for English, is direct them to the key information, teach them how to store that into their long-term memories by constantly revisiting it for them. Metacognition and the role of the classroom teacher then. So there are many different kinds of curriculum that we may be following. In this instance, I'll use the example of a knowledge-rich curriculum, which naturally lends itself to didactic delivery, but this is often at the cost of metacognitive strategies. And what metacognition does, if done well, is it enfranchises and empowers students. So if you do have a knowledge-rich curriculum, which I know many schools do at the moment, then it's really important that you put a focus on metacognition in English in order for students to cope with the deluge of information they'll be receiving every day. So as teachers, you impart your knowledge and address misconceptions, but your most important role is facilitating students' ability to adapt their learning strategies to meet the demands of this knowledge-rich curriculum or linear assessment or whatever the demands of your particular curriculum might be. And the way we do that is through recall and synthesis. It's important not to teach metacognition as a discrete subject or something which is bolted onto activities though, but rather to integrate metacognitive strategies that are signposted consistently during the learning. And I'll go through some of the strategies you can use in order to do that a little bit later on. I'd just like to share this with you. So Elevate Learning did some research. It's a few years ago now, but it's still as relevant today as it was a few years ago. And they looked at typicality amongst the highest achieving students, and they also looked at the impact of students who revised continuously throughout the year as opposed to just before a particular exam series. And they found that naturally, no revision meant very little progress, that relearning, which is the act of having learned something earlier in the year, not revisited it and forgotten about it completely, and therefore having to relearn it, had limited impact on progress. So our traditional forms of revision or our traditional notion of revision as something that takes place before exams actually has very little impact on progress. What has the most progress is revisiting skills and knowledge at regular intervals. So I mentioned before that Elevate Learning did their research on typicality in the top 5%, but specifically metacognitive typicality in the top 5%. And I just want to share with you the key findings from their research. So they looked at the top 400 high achieving students in the UK, and all of those students did the following things. So they revised continuously from structured linear notes, compartmentalized in discrete folders for each subject. Now, even on a basic level, if at the moment your students are using just one book and one page for language and then a couple of pages on for literature and so on, even telling them to use the back of their book for language or the front of their book for literature or vice versa could help them to structure that information in a way that's more easily absorbed for them. What I tend to do is have a different folder for language and for literature, and to encourage the students to find a way that suits them to structure that folder and to compartmentalise their notes, a way that they can access easily. The other thing that all of those 400 students did was they linked revision notes to the specification. Now, we often think of the specification as our guide to the course, but it's proven that the top achieving students actually use that specification as a blueprint for what they need to revise. In essence, then, what they are doing through using the specification is getting rid of the extraneous stuff that they don't need and focusing on what they do need. Now, I'm not saying that we don't do role modelling activities and drama activities, because I'm a huge advocate for that. And they, in fact, do allow us to explore texts. But what I am saying is use the specification as a starting point for students and refer back to it as you're teaching, and they will find it very, very useful. The 400 students also use colours, images and diagrams to link left and right brain. Now that is called dual coding, as I'm sure some of you already know, and we'll be doing a little bit more on dual coding as we go through the presentation. And the last thing that they did was they tested their own learning by using a range of quizzing methods best suited to their metacognitive preferences. So students are the experts in knowing how they learn best. What we need to do is to try and allow them to find those ways, to give them the skills, the knowledge and the time to find their own learning preferences. And we can do that through activities that we plan in our lessons, but ultimately the end goal is to make them more autonomous and for them to take control of their own learning. What are the cognitive loads then? I said earlier that I show some of these slides to students, and this is one of those slides that I always show to the students. So we've got our intrinsic load, our extraneous load, and our germane load. And I always have this little cartoon infographic on my wall as well, just so that students can see exactly what each of these means. So in a bit more detail then, the extraneous load is imposed by the manner in which information is presented to learners. So that could be a knowledge book, a graph, a video, a contextual clip you're showing them on YouTube. It's basically any information that they are receiving. And that extraneous load will be topped up by the lesson they go to next, and they'll already come with a lot of information and things milling around in that extraneous load from the lessons that they've had before, from home, from friends, etc. The intrinsic load then is imposed by the learning task. So this is where you narrow down that extraneous load into a specific set of activities that you're asking the student to do. So this is where your recall activities come in, your high stakes and low stakes quizzing, all of those activities, those interleaving activities that allow students to process information from the extraneous load that's relevant into the germane load. So this is devoted to processing that information, then constructing and automating schemas. So you set the task. Now, what the students do during those activities helps them to move that information to their germane load. So I always ask students to rework information, and I do that through summarising, paraphrasing, chunking. And I think it's important to explain to students why you are asking them to do that. So you're saying to them, through this activity, you're moving information through your extraneous load, through your intrinsic load, into your germane cognitive load. In other words, you're forging new pathways that will fire off, allowing you to access information in the future. So ask them to be autonomous, give them some information, but tell them to do something with that. Tell them to create something new. And if we're thinking in terms of Bloom's taxonomy, we're going from that, identification at the bottom of the pyramid, right the way through to creation and synthesis, because that is how they move things into their long-term memory. So wherever you can, ask students to turn information into something else, change its form. Even paraphrasing and summarising are great because they are naturally getting rid of all of the extraneous information and focusing on the key elements that they need. Now, the Education Endowment Foundation is an invaluable asset to us as practitioners, and it's something that I regularly refer to. I've included a couple of slides in this presentation from the EEF, but I would definitely recommend going off, having a look through the various catalogues of resources that you can use. So what you've got here is their colour-coded progression grid of metacognition and self-regulated learning. So it goes from number 1, teachers should acquire the professional understanding and skills to develop their pupils' metacognitive knowledge, and that involves things like this webinar right now, right the way through to schools should support teachers to develop knowledge of these approaches and expect them to be applied appropriately. So these are conversations that you can have internally as a department, and then on a whole school level if you feel that this is something that your students could benefit from across the curriculum. And there are more detailed implementation hints, tips and strategies on the EEF website, so definitely take a look at that. This here is another example of the planning proformas that they provide us as practitioners, and it talks about levels of metacognitive learner. And we go from tacit, aware, strategic and reflective. And this might be a nice activity to do in your department, where you reflect on concrete examples of things that you do that relate to these particular 4 areas in your practice. Again, that can be found on the EEF website. So I talked a lot about what metacognition is and why it's so important and why we should do it as English practitioners. So how do we explicitly teach metacognition in our lessons? And remember, we're not doing it in a bolted on way. It needs to be part of our practice. We need to model to the students how to make metacognition part of our everyday practice, and it will become part of their everyday practice as learners. Something that we brought in at QAS last year that we developed as a department were these English symbols. And we used the Learning to Learn tagline because I feel that that's just a really nice way for students to know exactly what this is. So it's very simply a series of symbols, and we've associated it with specific skills, tasks, activities that we do on a regular basis in English. And what we would do is we would put those symbols on a particular slide. So instead of explaining to the students, right, now during this activity, you're going to read the text, then you're going to skim or scan for specific information in a comprehension style activity. Well, rather than having to explain that again and again, if you explain them to at the beginning of the year, if you explain it to students at the beginning of the year and they associate it with that symbol, the dual coding that we'll come to a bit later on, linking left brain and right brain, they will associate that with that instruction. And so it saves us time as well as allowing students to understand explicitly what skill they might be using at any given time. So we have them there for reading, and then we have them for writing as well. I'm happy to send these out to anybody. If you would like a copy of anything that you've seen today, then please just drop me an email. My email address is on the website and it's on the last slide of this presentation as well. So you can see we've got things here as well, like peer assessing. So it's not just grammar, vocabulary, punctuation, but it's being aware of the benefits of discussing your work with a peer, not being afraid to discuss and critique one another's work. So from discussion to the very nuts and bolts of writing and the different strategies used for reading, our students do become aware of which symbol links to which activity we want them to do. Here's an example of a slide where we've used one of these symbols, the zoom symbol, and it's linked to word level analysis. In this example, students are writing a PEE, but the presence of that symbol there lets them know that within that PEE, they need to focus on the impact of something. So they know, because they've seen that zoom symbol, to reference what it makes us think, feel, or imagine as readers. Another nice activity to do is the knowledge dump, and many of you will be aware of this already, but it's great because it takes all of that extraneous information and literally dumps it. So it allows the students to sort the wheat from the chaff in terms of their thoughts. And what you can do to help them is focus it on a specific topic. Now you can make it really nebulous if you just want to reduce their extraneous load, or you can make it very specific if you want to transfer information from their intrinsic into their germane load. So you could ask them to produce quiz questions. I quite often ask my students to make trivial pursuit quizzes, but that's after we've whittled down what the important information is. So you could start with a knowledge dump exercise, get the students to write down everything they know about AO2, then get them to take the main or key information and produce a quiz from that. So they're working with the information, they've already got rid of the extraneous stuff, they've focused it, and now they're turning it into a different form. So they're creating something with it, and they're accessing those higher levels of Bloom, and also forging neural pathways so that they can access that information at a later date relatively easily. Here's the not so trivial pursuit that I just referred to, where students can, you know, just create their own game. Again, I've got this image, or I've got these worksheets ready, so if you'd like a copy of these, again, just send me an email and I'm happy to send these out to you. This works particularly well with the older students. Right, schema then. The stuff of fiction, or is it? So what you can see here is an extract from Sherlock. Let's just pause it. If you're familiar with this, I apologise, feel free to skip over it. If you're not familiar with it though, I'd like you to just watch it and decide whether you think this is the stuff of fact or of fiction.
Perfectly all right, but maybe it's not a drug. No, it has to be a drug.
Okay, so artistic license aside, obviously Sherlock is a high-functioning genius, and he takes it a little bit far with all of his gestures. But the mind palace that he calls it can be achieved. We can create that mind palace, and it's called schema. So what Sherlock has done there effectively is teach himself to create schema, almost like a schematic in his brain, so that he can access things very quickly. And he does that through metacognitive strategies such as dual coding. You'll notice that there were images flying past his face there, intermingled with words, and we can encourage our students to do that as well. So some of the ways that we can do that in English then. Here's an example of a dual coding worksheet that I would use with my A-level students, where I ask them to visualize a room. Now, it can be their own bedrooms, it can be your classroom, whatever it might be, it should be familiar to the student. So you just model how to do this. So I've compartmentalized my room. Language is symbolized by the chest of drawers, literary theory by the chair, and so on and so forth. And what I do in my lessons is I will clip that image or crop that image and just use the specific area of the room in the corner of the slide when I'm using anything that relates to one of those particular areas, or I'm asking the students to do an activity that relates to one of those areas. And it's just creating that dual coded link in their brains so that they don't have to think of everything they know about the salvaging in The Handmaid's Tale. They can think, right, window. Window is the start of the schema. It's their in to that domain load. So they'll think window, salvaging, and then they'll go into the specifics of that. Then they can apply literary theory to it, and so on and so forth. It sounds like it's an impossible thing to do, but it's really not. It's actually very, very easy. And once the students become familiar with these ways of working, they can encompass this in their own arsenal of revision techniques, and it will enhance the way that they revise. Another way, here are some examples of some mind maps. Now, I tend to do these ones for the students first on a particular element. So I've got AO2 there, outward use of language, and then I've got one on the feminine gospels. So model it for the students first, and it's useful if you have a visualizer to do this in real time so that the students can see that it's not necessarily a quick process, but it's one that will ultimately benefit them a great deal. Encourage them to use the colours, the different parts of the page for different topics, and encourage them to use small illustrations as well to help them remember specific bits. Okay. There is a link to the Teach Like a Champion website on the last slide of this presentation, but this is also something that I would advocate because there are many Teach Like a Champion strategies that link beautifully with the kind of metacognitive strategies that work incredibly well in English. So the following slides, explain what Teach Like a Champion is and the kinds of strategies that you can use with students. Now, this is a very condensed, potted version, so I would recommend that you buy the book, and again, there's a link to the website on the last slide, but it really helps you when you are explaining why we have to do something or why we are asking a student to do something. We all have classes who constantly ask, why have I got to copy that down? Why do I need to do this? Well, if you're teaching them the metacognition behind it, they no longer have to ask you why they're summarizing or why they're paraphrasing or why they're chunking this information, because they know how it benefits them. So introducing and embedding these strategies allows students to feel empowered, included, and engaged. Simply saying, because I'm the teacher and I'm telling you to, will disempower students. And we've all had examples of where we've done that, where we've become frustrated. So one of the slides that I regularly use with students right from the beginning of the year is a slant slide. So this is one of the Teach Like a Champion strategies. Sit up, listen, ask questions, make notes, and track when we're reading. All very simple things, but if you've got a poster of this in your room and you constantly remind students, rather than having to talk about all of those different things, you can say slant to them, and over a period where you've embedded it, they will just do it. Chunking, I love chunking, and I use this silly little Cocobon sort of emoji, and you can use whatever will appeal to your students. But I go through with students in the first few lessons what chunking is, what cold calling is, and a few of the other strategies that I use, so that they know the merits of these activities. They know that when I ask them to chunk, that means to paraphrase or to summarize, and it's to take the key information only and to make that easier for them to process. And after a few times of you explaining this, they're like, oh, right, okay, Mrs. asked us to chunk something, and they will just automatically do it rather than you needing to explain it all of the time. And you can see there, I try to explain as much as I possibly can about metacognition to the students. So brain boost, the more times you revisit information, the faster your brain retrieves it. If you ever finish a task and have a few spare moments, flip back through your knowledge book and create an information superhighway in your brain. Another strategy from TLAC, Teach Like a Champion, is cold call and why we do it. So again, putting them on the spot will force you to take in more information because you will want to recall it quickly when asked, to save embarrassment, to get your turnover with as quickly as you can. So I can ask any of you a question at any moment. That in itself puts a healthy amount of fear into the students. So knowing right from the beginning that one of your strategies is to cold call, to use their name, to use a wheel of names, to use icicle sticks, whatever, ice lolly sticks, whatever your particular strategy is. If they know you're going to do that and you do it regularly, they will always want to try and store as much information as possible so that they can recall it when asked. Front-loading vocabulary then. This is a fantastic strategy, not necessarily teach like a champion, but just generally brilliant practice if you are an English teacher or practitioner. So if we were asking students to read something like this, now this would be a year 13 lesson, let's say, and you're going into the realms of sort of Derrida or Foucault here. So let's think of those really verbose, difficult to access texts when we were at university. It would have helped us a lot more if instead of the professor or the lecturer standing there and enjoying the sound of their own voice and sounding mellifluous and erudite and wonderful, they actually explained what some of the words would be that they're about to use, because then we have some context, we have something to pin our understanding on. So to do that for your students is giving them that firm foundation to pin meaning, understanding, and then finally inference and synthesis upon. Ways you can front load vocabulary then. I'm giving you an example from a knowledge book. Now, I'm not at a school that uses a knowledge-rich curriculum at the moment, but we do use elements of that. So to supplement our lessons and our units of work, schemes of work, etc., we will give the students a knowledge book. And some of these knowledge books have 100, 200 pages in them, but it is a compendium of information of everything that will come up during the lessons. We've got one from Macbeth, for instance, which covers absolutely everything to do with Macbeth. We've got one for Inspector Calls. So any large text that the students have to study, excuse me, is supported by this knowledge book. Now, unlike in a school that has a knowledge-rich curriculum, we don't base our lessons on these books. It's supplementary rather than the basis of the lesson itself. But it is very useful for the students. One thing I do point towards in my teaching regularly, however, is the front-loading vocabulary section. Now, at the start of each section of the book, we have these yellow words. Again, the dual coding, they know that if it's in yellow or if it's highlighted in yellow, it's a key term, and they need to know what those key terms are. We also have in the back of our exercise books at QAS a glossary page for the students to write down any words that they're unfamiliar with as the year goes along. So this is definitely something that I would recommend that you do. So you can see here we've got some very, very technical words that or very sophisticated words that would come up in this lesson for Gothic genre. And it really helps students, particularly EAL students. It doesn't have to be really sophisticated vocabulary like this. If you're working with a BML group, you would break down even simple vocabulary for them at the start of the session, and then they can contextualize it when it appears later in the session. Okay. Another way that we can front load vocabulary, or to ask students to recall vocabulary that was front loaded in a previous lesson, is the closed passage. I won't dwell on this because we all use those quite frequently, I would have thought. Okay, embedding dual coding then. So we've looked at some of the ways that we can embed dual coding. And another way that you can do that is through your classroom environment. Now, I am huge on really vibrant, engaging displays. You'll fall between two stools here. I know there are some people who say, doesn't matter what you learn in the environment, looks like it's what takes place in it that counts. I understand that, but I think equally important is having an environment that's stimulating for students and having boards around the room that aren't just there to look pretty, but are also relevant and engaging at the same time. So I encourage my students to go and take a picture of this board at the start of the year. As you can see, I've got some of the slides that I've used in this presentation with you today, as well as an explanation of our teaching and learning ethos here at QAS. So for us, we use the O'Leary Dr. Ice ethos for teaching and learning. So it's deepening thinking, role modelling, impact on learning, challenge yourself, and engagement. And we try and make sure that all of the activities that we give to the students and our delivery hits one or more of those elements of Dr. Ice. Again, I've put a link to the O'Leary website at the end of this presentation if that appeals to you in your particular setting. Another way of dual coding, use those symbols. So if you're talking about consolidation, Tell the students what consolidation is, link it to a specific symbol. So my consolidation symbol, where students know that they're working with information that they already have, is the little Tetris image that you've got there. Another way of front-loading vocabulary, ask the students to define the words before an activity, particularly if it's a pre-1900 text like Frankenstein. Again, there you can see I've got my little clipboard, with a tick on it. That's my symbol for when students are going to get a low-stakes test. Here, we've got some Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde context. And I've asked the students to chunk it so they know what to do already there because it's embedded. Again, another example of consolidation and another example of testing. So when the students see those symbols or those signs or those images, they know what to do. Again, another example of chunking, another example of consolidation. So we now move on to scaffolding. So scaffolding autonomy in writing. So this is from Bedrova and Leong, and they say that scaffolding allows the teacher to help students transition from assisted tasks to independent performances. It is a step-by-step process that provides the learner with sufficient guidance until the process is learned and then gradually removes the support in order to transfer the responsibility for completing the task to the student. So ultimately, that is our goal as teacher. We want to get the students to a point where they are the experts and we are facilitating their learning, but ultimately they are leading their learning through employing the kind of metacognitive strategies that we've discussed so far. The teacher must provide students with the optimal amount of support necessary to complete the task and then progressively decrease the level of assistance until the student becomes capable of completing the activity independently. Again, there's a link to this article on the final slide. So in essence then, it's our jobs to train students, not necessarily to be the didact at the front of the class imparting our knowledge on students. That's a part of what we do, but it shouldn't be the overall goal or our ambition as teachers. So we should be the people who enable, empower students to be autonomous learners and to be the experts in our classroom. Ways that we can do that then, scaffolding for analysis paragraphs. You'll all use your own versions of these. But one of the teach like a champion strategies is the I do, we do, you do. And I found this the most effective way of scaffolding writing, whether that be analytical writing for reading questions or creative and imaginative writing or non-fiction writing, transactional writing. So a waggle, what a good one looks like, give students an example of what you want them to do one together, and then they do one autonomously. Here, that would be the we do. So I've given them sentence prompts, and then they'd go off, and now you do, and do one on your own. Again, I'm trying to use the dual coding and the symbols so that when they see the bowl and the spoon, they know that they need to include all of the ingredients of a PEFI, a PEE, a PFASI paragraph. And it's important to remind students of this. So at GCSE and at A-level, we often find that it limits students' ability to achieve the highest marks if they are using that very formulaic response. So to try and encourage students to move away from that, do it early. So in Key Stage 3, remind students that all of the ingredients of a PEFI paragraph, PFASI paragraph, PEE paragraph, don't need to be done necessarily in that order, because then what you're doing is you're allowing all students to express themselves in that fluent, articulate way that they need to do for GCSE and A-level and develop those skills early on. So for your lower ability students, they might never progress from the formulaic way of structuring paragraphs, and that's fine, but we're not precluding the other students from expressing themselves in a more fluent, less formulaic way. Here's another type of paragraph, an OFL paragraph, another type of paragraph, a squid paragraph, and again you can see I've got my little images all the time. Another good strategy is to use big questions and small questions. So you can see on this slide here The small question is how can I make inferences from two sources and effectively use squid? Now, that would be part of a big question. So when you are coming up with a particular scheme of work, devising it as a department, or if you've assigned it to two or more people to do, think of big questions and small questions. And I found that incorporating these into schemes of work can be really useful. So the big question might be, how do writers convey meaning? Assessment objectives are a great source of extracting big questions from. And then your small question feeds into the larger question. And then what you'd do is you'd recall activities at the start of a lesson, for instance. You could do it at the beginning, you could do it at the end, so long as students know when it's coming. So the recall activity here is revise your spellings ready for your week 2 test. Live modelling then, the I do. This is just another example of what I was talking about. I do, we do, you do. And there's a waggle. And here's another more structured, scaffolded resource that you could use. Okay, so further reading then, that draws us to the end of the session. I hope you found some of it useful. And I've just put some books here that I feel you might be interested in if, like me, you're incredibly passionate about metacognition. So Teaching Students to Drive Their Brains is a great book. What you do with an idea is just beautiful. This works particularly well with primary students or sort of year 7 lower key stage 3 students, and then teach students how to learn. I mean, there are a plethora of books on this subject, but those are 3 nice ones I find. And then if you have any questions, given that this is pre-recorded, please do email me, and I will aim to get back to you swiftly and in as much detail as I possibly can. So it's been great being with you all today, and if you want to reference any of the things I've talked about today, you'll find all of the links on this last slide here. Okay, take care, and I will hope to speak to you, some of you via email, and if not, I will see you at the next webinar. Take care.